my conversation with Pascal Lamy, the former WTO Director General. We have conversations several times a year, but this time I was struck by his tone of both urgency and calmness in front of the heated debate of WTO reform and China-U.S. trade relations. Let's listen in. Mr. Lamy, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing.
Pleasure.
I guess we have to continue our conversation about the trade disputes. So what do you make of the latest development? It seems that both sides have been putting a lot of efforts into the negotiation itself.
Yeah, I think for the moment, the game is as if US, China, EU, Japan were looking to improve the WTO by reforming it. Now, I'm quite sure that this is the EU stance, that this is the Japanese stance, that this is the Chinese stance. I'm not sure about the US stance. But whether the US are really trying to negotiate improvements or whether they are trying to demand things which they know is not possible, to be able at the end of the day to say, we told you this is not reformable and we have to kill the system, I don't know. But I think we Europeans, together with Japan, to try and keep US in the tent and bring China more into the tent, which means that on both sides, including on the Chinese side, they will have to accept a bit more disciplines in WTO in some areas, such as, for instance, subsidization, which, by the way, seems to fit with this new concept which has been floated here in Beijing of competitive neutrality, which I understand as readiness to level the playing field between the state-owned enterprises and private sector.
But Mr. Lamy, aren't we facing the danger that even the global trade system is to collapse very soon because of the dispute settlement area would not work as a result of the appellate body dysfunctioning? Are we going to face some very different crisis in nature, in fact?
I don't think so. I don't think so, although I recognize that the US have taken the dispute settlement of WTO hostage. I think there are various ways to fix this problem.
Like what?
Like, for instance, a majority decision to appoint judges, which, by the statute of WTO, seems to be possible. For example, in addressing a number of problems which the US have with the dispute settlement system. If the US believe the judges over-interpreted the WTO law, when they lost cases, by the way, they never believe they interpreted wrongly the WTO when they win cases. It's only when they lose cases. Let's assume they may be right. This is perfectly addressable. But for the moment, the US have not shown their hands. They haven't said, this is what we want from a reform of the dispute settlement system and of the appellate body. So until and unless we have a clear view of what they want, it's going to be difficult. But I think the system can live while a negotiation on how to improve the appellate body takes place.
Can WTO afford the US walk away? Since that is a catchphrase, it seems that President Trump has been very fascinated about.
I agree with that. He has been threatening to quit the WTO. Whether this is serious or not, I don't know. I think this would be at a huge cost for the US economy. Think, for instance, a moment that they would lose the protection of the TRIPS agreement, the WTO agreement that protects US intellectual property worldwide, would disappear, and US IP would only be enforced within the US territory. That would be a huge damage for the US economy. So I don't think it will happen. I think this is bluff, but in case it would happen, we have to be ready to think about a WTO minus the US. We can perfectly think of a WTO without the US. Mr. Trump says to everybody, my way or no way. This is not acceptable.
Now you see, Mr. Lamy, a lot of active diplomacy taking place between China and the European countries. Chinese president visit to Italy, France, for example, the European Commission's discussion about their so-called possibly coordinated China approach. How much do you think these will really bring China and the European countries, I mean the European capitals, and the EU together about a consensus about trade and about the future of trade?
I think EU, like Japan, by the way, is trying to remain somewhere in between US and China. They are trying to mediate, and if you look at what has been tabled in the WTO negotiations, some proposals are sponsored by US, EU, Japan, others are sponsored by EU and China. So EU is trying to put pressure on China with the US and put pressure on US with China. And the reason for that is very simple. US or China may think bilateralism is good for them. They have the capacity to do that. They are big, they are powerful, they have big armies, they have big defense systems, they have big diplomatic systems, they are strong. EU or Japan, by the way, cannot afford bilateralism. They are, in a way, too weak. They only have the multilateral option. And this leads them to try and make sure that we keep a multilateral trading system. So on this, I think China has expressed the view that they won't go bilateral, although trying to cook a deal with the US, which might have a rather bilateral smell. We will see what's in there, whether it's just a bit of managed trade, because Mr. Trump likes exports and not imports, so he thinks the US-China trade balance should be fixed. Maybe it will reduce the US-China trade imbalance and increase the US trade imbalance with other countries, which is likely to happen in my view. But whether or not this addresses structural problems is an open question. No, there's nothing like a bilateral subsidy. So if it's a question of China accepting steps forward, more disciplines on subsidies, these are of a multilateral nature, not of a bilateral nature.
Not only the existing international system, but also some of the new mechanisms. I'm sure, Mr. Lamy, you've been hearing a lot about discussions and debates about Belt and Road Initiative. That's about connectivity that, of course, will have an impact and being impacted by trade. So, Mr. Lamy, what do you make of this fierce debate going on about the nature of the BRI?
No, I think it's a very powerful initiative that could fill a gap in international cooperation, which is that there is not enough investment in infrastructures. We know that whether it's about transport, energy, water, this planet is short of infrastructures. So in many ways, this is a good thing to do. Now, problem, I think, is that so far it has been seen as a sort of one-way street. It's China who decides, China who puts the money on the table, Chinese companies who build and operate these systems. So there will have to be, in my view, in the future, a bit more feeling of reciprocity, and I think under these conditions, it can benefit everybody, and it deserved to be pushed, provided, again, it's not seen as one-sided.
About technology, China and Italy's cooperation, for example, about technologies, that was quite a debate if you look at the press coverage over the past few days. So will EU be able, or European capitalists be able to make its own independent decisions, rather be free from all the obligations that others try to set on them? That's a big question mark too, isn't it?
I think EU is moving in a direction of more coordinated approach vis-à-vis China. None of EU countries today is able by itself to establish a balanced cooperation situation with China. China is too big, too strong. So the only way for the Europeans to be on par with China is to unite and have common positions. Which is why, for instance, the French president asked Chancellor Merkel and the president of the EU Commission to attend one of the discussions he's having with President Xi to give a signal that there are now coordinated EU positions. I think it's inescapable. And by the way, I think if China wants EU to be stronger to defend the multilateral system, you need a strong EU to do that. So, you cannot have it both ways.
So, Mr. Lamy, as you may know, China celebrated 40 years of reform and opening up. This year, China's 70th anniversary. So there is a lot of discussion about the path that we have taken and what can we learn, lessons and experiences. From a trade expert's perspective and from your personal interaction with your Chinese friends, any specific thoughts could be as inspiration?
I think what the experience of these last 40 years has shown, like, by the way, what the whole of the Chinese history has shown, is that when China opens, it's good for China.
Yeah.
When China closes, it's bad for China. China has been the major world economy for 15 centuries since the beginning of the Christian era. It disappeared from the world economy domination during roughly 250 years when it closed its economy. And I think this is exactly what Deng Xiaoping had in mind when he said we have to reopen in order to become again a major world economy. So this is what history tells us. And I think this is the big lesson. You need to open to grow.
Yeah.
China did that. It worked incredibly well. So well that I personally don't think it's replicable anywhere else. I do not agree that there is a Chinese model that others should imitate or emulate. It's a very specific situation, not least because of the size of the country. So reforming, opening is the way to go. That's the big lesson. And so far, China did it in a way that is more rational, with less accidents than in other continents. Now, does this mean that everything is fine? No, because the sort of convergence which Deng Xiaoping had initiated, and which lasted roughly from the 80s to the mid-2000, has changed at that time. With the economic crisis, China regrew the part of its economy which is under state command, and this part is less efficient, less productive than the private sector. And this is something that I think now needs to be addressed. There's been a lot of talk about reform and opening up and celebrating these 40 years and these 70 years. What we need is a bit of work. I think recent decisions, including this legislation on foreign investment, are in the right direction. More to come, in my view.